There is a battle happening around you every single day. Most people know it exists. Very few people understand what is actually being fought over. People think the battle is political. Some think it is economic. Others think it is cultural. Some think it is religious. But beneath all of those battles is another one that quietly shapes them all. A battle for perspective, a battle for how you see, a battle for how you interpret reality, a battle for what things mean. Because the truth is this: whoever influences your perspective does not need to control your life directly. Once they influence how you see, much of the work is already done. Think about that. If I can shape how you interpret success, I can influence your goals. If I can shape how you interpret failure, I can influence your confidence. If I can shape how you interpret relationships, I can influence your choices. If I can shape how you interpret yourself, I can influence your future. And that is why perspective matters far more than most people realize. The problem is that many people spend their entire lives protecting perspectives they never consciously choose. They defend them, they repeat them, they build identities around them. Yet they have never stopped long enough to ask, where did this come from? Who taught me this? Why do I believe this? Is this even true? I think one of the most dangerous things that can happen to a human being is not ignorance. It is inherited certainty. Because ignorance can learn, certainty often refuses to. A person who knows they don't know can still grow. A person who thinks they already know everything has quietly closed the door to discovery. And that is where I want to begin. Not with the world, not with society, not with politics, not with institutions. I want to begin with you and me. Because before anybody else can influence us, there is something we need to understand about ourselves. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We are constantly interpreting, constantly explaining, constantly creating stories. Something happens, we immediately ask what it means. Someone ignores our message, we interpret. A business fails, we interpret. A relationship ends, we interpret. We lose money, we interpret. We get promoted, we interpret. Life is not simply what happens. Life is what happens plus the meaning we attach to what happens. And that meaning is largely shaped by perspective. Two people can experience the exact same event and walk away with completely different conclusions. One sees opportunity, the other sees disaster. One sees a lesson, the other sees punishment. One sees temporary difficulty, the other sees permanent defeat. The event may be identical, the interpretation is not. And interpretation often determines outcome. Years ago, I started paying attention to something interesting. Whenever people talked about their lives, they were rarely talking about reality itself. They were talking about their interpretation of reality. Someone would say, nothing ever works out for me. Another person would say, the world is against people like me. Someone else would say, success is only for lucky people. And after listening carefully, I realized something. Many of these statements were not observations, they were perspectives. And perspectives, when repeated long enough, begin to feel like facts. Let me say that again. Perspectives, when repeated long enough, begin to feel like facts. That's where the danger begins. Because once a perspective feels like a fact, we stop examining it. We stop questioning it. We stop testing it. We simply live inside it. Imagine putting on a pair of glasses when you're 5 years old, then forgetting you are wearing them. By the time you are 40, you no longer know the difference between the glasses and reality. Everything you see passes through that lens. Everything. That is what perspective often does. It becomes invisible, and anything invisible has enormous power. You see, most people believe manipulation begins when somebody tells you what to do. That's not always true. The most effective influence often happens long before instructions are given. It happens at the level of perception. If I can shape what you notice, I influence what you value. If I can shape what you value, I influence your decisions. If I influence your decisions consistently enough, I influence your life. This is why perspective is so valuable. This is why it is constantly being competed for. Every advertisement is selling more than a product. It is selling a perspective. Every political movement is selling a perspective. Every ideology is selling a perspective. Every social movement is selling a perspective. Every influencer is selling a perspective. Every organization is selling a perspective. Sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. But perspectives are always being offered. The question is whether you are choosing yours deliberately or simply absorbing whatever is closest. Think about how much information enters your mind every day. News, social media, conversations, videos, podcasts, articles, comments, messages, opinions, predictions, outrage, fear, excitement, comparison, all flowing constantly. And yet, many people never stop to ask a simple question: what is all of this doing to the way I see? Not what is it teaching me? What is it doing to the way I see? Because seeing comes before deciding. Seeing comes before acting. Seeing comes before becoming. And that is why this matters. Now, let me make something clear. This is not an argument for becoming suspicious of everything. Some people hear conversations like this and become cynical. They start believing everyone is trying to manipulate them. That is not wisdom. That is another trap. The goal is not paranoia. The goal is awareness. The goal is not refusing influence. That is impossible. Every human being is influenced. The goal is becoming conscious of influence. There's a difference. A healthy person recognizes influence without becoming controlled by it. A healthy person can listen without surrendering discernment. A healthy person can learn without abandoning independent thoughts. And that ability is becoming increasingly important because we live in a world where attention has become one of the most valuable commodities on earth. Everybody wants your attention. Everybody. And once attention is captured, perspective often follows. Have you ever noticed how two people can watch the same event and leave feeling completely different things? One person feels hopeful, the other feels terrified. One feels inspired, the other feels angry. One sees possibility, the other sees collapse. What changed? Not necessarily the event, the lens, the frame, the perspective. That is why some of the most important questions in life are not about information. They are about interpretation. And yet, interpretation is one of the least examined parts of human life. People spend years upgrading their income, very little time upgrading their perspective. People spend years improving skills, very little time examining assumptions. People spend years trying to change outcomes, very little time investigating the lens producing those outcomes. And that is why many people remain stuck. Not because they lack effort, not because they lack intelligence, but because they are attempting to solve problems from inside the same perspective that created them. Now, this may feel uncomfortable because perspective is deeply personal. It often becomes tied to identity. And whenever identity becomes involved, objectivity becomes difficult. Nobody likes questioning the ideas that helped them make sense of the world. Nobody likes discovering that something they treated as truth might only be an interpretation. Nobody enjoys that. But growth often begins where comfort ends. Think about the major turning points in your own life, the moments that truly changed you. Was it new information? Sometimes. But often it was a new perspective. The facts may have remained exactly the same, yet the meaning changed. And when meaning changed, everything changed. Maybe you once saw failure as evidence that you were incapable. Then one day, you saw it as feedback. Nothing changed externally. Everything changed internally. Maybe you once saw criticism as rejection. Then one day, you saw it as information. The event remained the same. The interpretation changed. Maybe you once saw setbacks as proof that life was against you. Then one day you saw them as preparation. Same circumstances, different perspective, different future. That is the power of perspective. Now, here's where things become really interesting. Many people think they are independent thinkers simply because they disagree with others. But disagreement is not the same thing as independent thoughts. Sometimes people merely adopt the opposite perspective. That is not ownership. That is reaction. True ownership requires examination. It requires curiosity. It requires asking difficult questions. It requires intellectual honesty. And intellectual honesty is rare because it often demands that we admit something uncomfortable. We may not know as much as we think we know. That sentence sounds simple, but it is one of the most liberating realizations a person can have. Because the moment you stop pretending you know everything is the moment learning becomes possible again. The moment sanctity loses its grip, growth can begin. The moment you become curious about your own assumptions, transformation becomes possible. I think one of the greatest dangers of modern life is not misinformation. It is unexamined information, not bad ideas or questioned ideas, not influence, unconscious influence. Because anything that enters your mind repeatedly without examination eventually begins shaping your perception. And perception eventually shapes behavior. Behavior shapes habits. Habits shape outcomes. Outcomes shape lives. This is why perspective is not some abstract philosophical concepts. It is practical, extremely practical. Your perspective influences how you spend money, how you choose relationships, how you raise children, how you handle pressure. how you respond to criticism, how you define success, how you recover from failure, how you interpret opportunity, how you see yourself. In many ways, your perspective is quietly writing your future every single day. Which brings us to a difficult question. If your perspective is shaping so much of your life, how much of it actually belongs to you? Not your parents, not your culture, not your friends, not your social media feed, not your favorite personalities, you. How much of it has been consciously examined? How much has been tested? How much has been chosen? Because if you never choose your perspective, somebody else will happily choose it for you. And the frightening thing is that you may never notice. You may spend years believing your thoughts are entirely your own. Years, decades even, without ever recognizing how many of those thoughts arrived prepackaged from somewhere else. That is why awareness matters. Not so you become suspicious, not so you become isolated, not so you reject everything, but so you can see clearly, because clarity creates freedom, and freedom begins with seeing, not seeing what everyone else sees, seeing what is actually there. And sometimes those are very different things. As we close this first conversation, I want to leave you with something simple. Over the next few days, pay attention to your strongest opinions, the opinions that feel obvious, the opinions that feel unquestionable, the opinions that feel automatic. Ask yourself one question. Where did this come from? Not whether it is right or wrong. Start somewhere simpler. Where did it come from? Who taught me this? What experiences shaped it? What assumptions support it? What evidence sustains it? Because that question may reveal more than you expect. And it might just be the beginning of reclaiming something many people lose without ever realizing it: their own perspective. In the next episode, we are going to explore how perspectives are actually manufactured. Not through conspiracy theories, not through secret meetings in dark rooms, but through ordinary systems, ordinary incentives, ordinary habits, and ordinary influences that shape how people see the world every single day. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it.